The title sponsor of this episode of Energy Wake Up is MMA Energy Capital. MMA Energy Capital partners with developers, EPC contractors, and system owners to provide flexible debt capital in the solar space, and as former developers, MMA believes they add a unique perspective to the lending practice. MMA's primary products include development lending, construction financing, as well as some more customized solutions around bridge and mezzanine financing. The transaction sizes completed by MMA range significantly from $2 million development loans to over $100 million construction financing and include traditional behind-the-meter projects, community solar, and utility solar deals. Over the past 3 years, MMA has funded a portfolio of projects throughout 17 states and 1 U.S. territory, and to date, they have committed almost $1 billion in capital to develop and or construct 1.45 gigawatts of solar. Find more information at MMA Energy Capital or email me for a personal introduction at jan@solarwakeup.com. I want to thank all of our SolarWakeup Live DC sponsors, GAF, Mintz Levin, NTCIC, Standard Solar, True Green Capital, and MMA Energy Capital. Sponsorship opportunities for SolarWakeup Live New York are now available. Contact me for more information. None of these events would be possible without the gracious support from these sponsors.
Fortuitously, we have Audrey Louison from Mintz. She's the chair of the Project Development and Finance practice, a member of the Energy and Sustainability practice. She's done over 500 transactions. I've never been on her side of the table. I've been on the other side of the table. So she's fair and she did a good job.
We're still friends.
Yes.
Well, we're friends again.
Yes. And you are based right here in DC.
I am.
Second is Greg Jenner. He's the partner. He's a partner at Stoel Rives in their tax practice. He was interim assistant secretary of Treasury in 2004. Prior to that, he was the deputy assistant secretary of tax policy in Treasury from 2002 to 2004. But most importantly and most relevant, which is why I'm really happy he's here, he was tax counsel of the Senate Committee on Finance a few decades ago and helped write the last major tax reform bill of 1986. So we're going to talk about the politics of this tax reform bill, but also kind of the nuances of how it will impact the solar industry. Let's start with the political reality of this tax bill. Regardless of what's in it, is it going to happen?
Yes. It will. I don't think there's a doubt.
So there's no doubt it's going to happen. And I mean, walk through now the nuances of it.
Okay. That was curt and short. And
into the we're recording.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Podcast.
That scares me even more. No, I was trying to make a point by saying yes. Clearly, it's. I don't think that there is a. I don't see a scenario where it doesn't. They have invested too much. They've gone too far out on a limb. The little kerfuffles that we're seeing, you always see in one way, shape, or form with tax legislation. You know, this one just happens to be Farm Republic. These things are going to get fixed. You know, particularly the stuff that happened last minute in the Senate. That was just intended to get them over the goal line, and that stuff will get resolved in conference. So yeah, I put money on it.
So some of the major things that are sticking points currently from voting are, and we'll get into it in each of them, is politically the California delegation has a problem with the state and local tax deduction. Senator Collins has her own issues around what she was promised and what she may or may not have believed to become reality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this corporate AMT point. Let's start with the corporate AMT point. Walk us through what it is, what the impact is, and how it could get resolved.
Okay. Well, let's a little background, and if I start to see eyes rolling in the back of your head, I'll know I've gone too far. Both bills all along were going to repeal the corporate AMT. And that was fine. And what they were going to do, of course, was to bring the regular tax rate down to 20%. The corporate AMT rate, by the way, happens to be 20%. So at the last minute on the Senate floor, they needed revenue for some reason. And so as an expedient, as I said, to get them over the goal line, they shoved the AMT back in. In other words, they didn't repeal it. The law of unintended consequences took over at that point. And in a couple of different ways. The first one, having to do with renewables, although not solar, was that the way the AMT works, you can only claim the production tax credit against the AMT for 4 years out of the 10 years for which it's available, which means that old wind deals that are getting into 5 through 10 years, all of a sudden those credits lose their value. And it stopped a lot of deals from getting funding, existing deals. So that was one problem. The second problem, however, is one that's just starting to surface. And that is, again, because of the way the AMT works. Effectively you would have the AMT at 20%, the regular tax rate at 20%, but the way the AMT works is you have all these add backs. And all of these add backs, that would have come about as a result of the other international changes in the bill, would have effectively gutted all of the international changes. And so, and they missed it. They didn't realize that it was going to happen once they shoved the AMT back in. So now you have a situation where if they were to enact the Senate bill and do nothing else, effectively we would not be moving to a territorial international system anymore. We would be staying with a worldwide system, which of course is anathema to the Republicans. So they're going to get rid of the AMT. I mean, the problem is going to get fixed in conference. It was just an expedient anyway.
And so, Audrey, you're more on the contract structuring side of things. What happens when a deal that's structured with tax equity has a change in law that changes potentially the value that was assumed or anticipated at the front end? What kind of language is in the partnership? What kind of language, on a very high level, what kind of language is in the partnership agreements that solar developers, solar sponsors, and tax equity investors should be thinking about now that this uncertainty, we don't know what happens in 2 or 3 years. How do the contracts deal with that kind of uncertainty?
Right. Well, of course, that depends on who your lawyers are. But a lot of over the last year since Trump was elected and the potential for tax changes has been on the horizon that could affect renewable power. The tax equity deals, which is really what you're talking about here, have been structured to contemplate the possibility of that happening. And so if you're doing partnership flips, if you're familiar with that, or sale leasebacks, tax equity structures that get put in place in anticipation of a project being placed in service at a later date. The language around the commitments that the tax equity investors are making to provide those funds at the place in service date are going to have caveats in those for a potential change in law. So early on, as this issue was kind of germinating, the language was fairly broad, and you find documents that will say in them, well, if there's a potential or proposed change in tax law, the tax equity is only going to come in for some percentage of the amount ultimately required in the capital stack. And later on, if that doesn't pan out, if we don't have those, the tax reform that reduces the value of the tax credits, then will come in for the rest. There'll be a true up. I think that that language didn't anticipate governance by tweet. And so the concept of what is a proposed tax change was not very well defined. As people kind of cottoned on to what was potentially going on and what a complete mess we were in, I'm sorry, that was a little overly political, but those definitions started getting more highly differentiated and looked at. And so the more recent deals will say things like, you know, it has to be a deal that, legislation that has come out of both houses, that is in conference, where the where the two chambers have a fairly closely aligned bill, things like that, incidents that would lead commercial actors to believe that something was really going to happen. Here we are today, and I think we are in fact there. So I think even the most carefully crafted definitions of change in law and impact on the tax equity investments are here. We have transactions like that ongoing now. Certainly anything that's in the works now where the documents are being negotiated, this is going to be, they're probably going to be done on the basis of the assumed passage of the tax law with maybe some potential true-ups. But I think now the focus is really going to be on how to mitigate the need for to rejig the capital stacks of the deal to cover for that slice of tax equity that's not going to be available.
Interesting. So, Greg, the other big headline is on a topic that I'd never heard about before. I still don't understand, but it's this BEAT provision, the base erosion anti-abuse tax.
What the hell is it?
What the hell is it?
Again, let's back up a second and think about what they're trying to do with the international provisions. Right now, the way we tax multinational corporations is we tax them on their worldwide income. So everything that they earn throughout the world is subject to U.S. tax, with two tweaks. The first tweak is that they get a foreign tax credit in the United States for taxes that they pay to a foreign country. So if Pfizer has a subsidiary in France, and France imposes a 20% tax, the U.S. would tax it at 35, but provide Pfizer a credit of 20, meaning that the residual tax in the United States is only 15, total 35. That's step one. Step two is something called deferral. And this is where we get into this repatriation provision that everybody's talking about, where the tax that the U.S. imposes on that residual is not imposed until the money is repatriated to the United States in the form of a dividend or something equivalent to a dividend. And that's why, you know, all these multinationals have all this money parked offshore, because they don't want to incur this residual tax. So that's current law. What they are going to move to is what's been referred to as a participation system, a dividend exemption system, or colloquially a territorial system, where the U.S. does not impose a tax on the income earned in France at all. Okay, so that can make some sense from a policy standpoint. It's debatable, but you know, assume that that's where they want to move to. Well, not surprisingly, when you put that system in place, you have created a Swiss cheese tax system, where mobile capital in the form of intangibles, intellectual property, etc., can be parked on the Isle of Man, which does not tax corporate income at all, and immediately brought back to the United States with no tax consequences at all. Now, how do you prevent that? Well, if you'll recall back to the Dave Camp tax proposal in 2014, he had all sorts of rules in place to prevent base erosion, and that's what this is referring to. Camp had very sophisticated rules. The House has some sophisticated rules. the Senate came up with a blunt instrument, and that's the BEAT tax. It basically is nothing more than a minimum tax imposed to prevent U.S. multinationals from eroding the corporate tax base. Right, it's the right policy. I mean, you know, they created a problem, now they have to fix it. The problem is how they fixed it. They fixed it by designing this minimum tax in such a way that certain multinationals, not everyone, but certain multinationals may get caught, and the value of the tax credits that they use in the United States may be worthless. Again, it's this minimum tax concept.
Explain why, though. Why do their U.S. tax investments become worthless?
Well, because basically in calculating the BEAT tax, the anti-abuse tax, you don't get to use tax credits except for the research and development tax credit. That's the one golden child in the panoply of tax credits that you can use against the BEAT tax. The rest of them are out the window. And so, you know, as you do these calculations, corporation by corporation, it's, you know, we know of one that big funder of tax equity, they said, we don't care, that we're fine with it. But, you know, not everyone is going to be fine with it. As they do these calculations, they may very well determine that the value of the tax credits or the amount of tax credits that they need goes down. And as a consequence, what we could be seeing is a contraction of the money available for tax equity. It's not a direct tax on tax credits or tax equity. It's a possible decline in the willingness of the usual suspects to invest.
The title sponsor of this episode of Energy Wake Up is MMA Energy Capital. MMA Energy Capital partners with developers, EPC contractors, and system owners to provide flexible debt capital in the solar space, and as former developers, MMA believes they add a unique perspective to the lending practice. MMA's primary products include development lending, construction financing, as well as some more customized solutions around bridge and mezzanine financing. The transaction sizes completed by MMA range significantly from $2 million development loans to over $100 million construction financing, and include traditional behind-the-meter projects, community solar, and utility solar deals. Over the past 3 years, MMA has funded a portfolio of projects throughout 17 states and 1 U.S. territory, and to date, they have committed almost $1 billion in capital to develop and or construct 1.45 gigawatts of solar. Find more information at MMA Energy Capital or email me for a personal introduction at jan@solarwakeup.com.
So in essence, what it does is it reduces, amongst all the other things in the bill, it reduces the amount of available or potentially interested tax capital, tax equity.
It could, and we have to be careful. I think there's been a little bit of hysteria. And hysteria is not always a bad thing, but in this case, you have to be careful. It could reduce the demand. It's going to be situational. It's going to be investor by investor. As I said, I'm working on a deal now that's supposed to be signed up any day, where our investor said, BEAT is not a problem for us. We're still in the deal. And we're all doing our happy dance as a result. But there are other transactions out there where we haven't heard from the big multinational investors yet as to whether or not BEAT is a problem. But that's the issue.
So we spoke before this, and essentially all of these rounding error, these different pieces of the puzzle are going to get fixed by shifting the corporate rate up from the 20%, but it will still be significantly less than what it is today.
Yeah.
Audrey, if a deal was done earlier this year, and now the corporate tax rate goes down, which will impact next year's taxes and the year after that, all of this depreciation that is now worth less, how have the contracts changed, or how do the contracts change or adjust for this this reduction in value that's created to tax equity, and what impacts will it have on the partnerships as a whole?
Right. So for tax equity structures that are already in place, that have already closed, those allocations of the profits and losses, income and loss in those deals will remain as they are drafted, and the allocations of tax will remain as they are drafted as well. A couple of things will be affected. One, in most cases, and the documents are not consistent, they're all a little bit different, but just taking maybe sort of a reference case, the calculation of the actual economic effect of the allocations of income and losses and the cash distributions is going to be on the actual tax rate. So in most deals, let's take a partnership flip kind of structure, that's going to have a yield-based requirement that's probably generally going to say that the tax equity investor will have reached its effective yield at some specific date at a certain time, and if it hasn't achieved that yield by that time or that IRR, then they're going to start to sweep cash so that they can accelerate when they reach that flip date.
So these cash sweeps might get put into effect.
And the cash sweeps are going to get put into effect. That's going to have an impact on the debt associated with those transactions, if there's leverage on those deals, and the way that those are set up. In some cases, there are limitations on how much cash can be swept in order that there be enough cash available to pay debt service. It's going to push out the sponsor, the common equity, their return and residual value further out. There's some mitigant to that, which is that to the extent of cash distributions from those projects, the tax rate on those is going to be lower. So that's going to increase the value of those actual cash distributions. That will have some mitigating effect. I don't know how it comes out in the wash in terms of where the inflection points of that are.
I'm thinking if you have a deal that's 3 to 4 years done, you're happy with the 20% rate.
Because it lowers it increases the free cash flow to the sponsor.
No, it doesn't increase cash flow. You hit your flip point earlier, because there's less tax imposed on the investor, and therefore their IRR gets hit. It goes up faster. If you're about to sign a deal, you are praying for the Senate bill, because the Senate bill delays the corporate tax rate for 1 year, the reduction in the corporate tax rate for 1 year. So that will allow you to claim your depreciation at 35 and effectively
for the first year.
For the first year, because it's all going to be in 1 year, basically. Because expensing applies immediately, while at the same time you're going to recapture that income effectively at 20. So you've got a 15% arbitrage. So you're praying for the Senate.
How much erosion of value of tax equity in a solar capital stack do you think a 20 to 25% tax rate generates?
I'm guessing. I'm just throwing a number out, 5%, something like that. Maybe even less. I mean, because again, the major driver, of course, are the tax credits, and those aren't going to be affected either by tax rate or otherwise.
Does there's some impact to the other tax credit, right? This is not just an attack on solar tax credits. This is tax reform. So the wind PTC.
No, it's not tax reform. Under no circumstances can you label it
as smarter people have labeled it. It's the Donor Relief Act of 2017. So you've got the solar tax credit, the wind tax credit, the new market tax credit, low-income housing tax credits, sort of in a bucket of tax credits that investors, right, corporate tax allocators are in a position to deploy. Do any of those come out on top versus others? Does it reduce the overall, because it reduces the overall pie, there's less tax liability out there. Do any of these rules push advisors to go more towards one than the other?
The House bill repeals new markets, so that they don't come out.
Well, right. So that comes out of the.
Yeah, the rehab credit gets very severely limited in the House bill, not the Senate bill. You know, I think that low-income housing, because it's not limited to a pool, a very small pool of investors, it tends to be done by community banks, etc. They're probably going to be better off, but I'm not sure that anybody wins. It's just who loses less.
So between wind and solar, does one lose less? I mean, let me back it up and say, does solar really, like, yes, it's going. There's some erosion in the value of the tax equity, and you know, maybe that's made up by less projects and more fight over who gets to invest in those. Is there really a huge impact to both the availability of tax equity for solar developers, as well as how they have to reassess their capital stack?
Well, I think there's the potential. The 20% rate in and of itself may reduce the demand for tax equity, or excuse me, the supply of tax equity. Layered on top of that is the BEAT tax, which could potentially really adversely affect supply of tax equity. Putting those two things aside, though, there really isn't a dramatic impact on solar or wind. Wind projects that have not begun construction in the House bill, under the House bill, are not going to get the 2.4 per kilowatt, cent per kilowatt credit. They're only going to get 1.5 unindexed for inflation. So it's a slap there. The solar ITC is originally reduced to 0 under the House bill, not the Senate bill. I don't know how dramatic those impacts are. So, you know, I don't, absent the effect of BEATs and the 20% rate, you know, I wouldn't call this catastrophic. It's indirect.
Does BEAT stay in?
You know, that's an interesting question.
Because it's only in the Senate version.
Correct. And they got to do something. You know, they have to do something, because again, they've got, if they're going to stick with territoriality without something BEATs like or the equivalent or what's in the House bill, they've got the Swiss cheese tax system. And I can guarantee you the tax planners up in New York are salivating at the possibility of planning. One thing, by the way, I don't want to lose sight of, and I apologize for dominating this. There's another provision that actually has a potential to affect solar deals, again, indirectly. It's the 30% cap on business interest. For these deals,
can you say that louder? I'm sorry.
the 30% cap on deductibility of business interest. I'm not seeing a note of recognition, so you haven't heard of this one. Both bills impose a cap on the deductibility of business interest. Now, as we know, most of these deals are not leveraged internally, but they do a lot of back leverage. And back leverage, you know, in other words, where the sponsor pledges its interest in the partnership as collateral for the loan above the partnership, will get affected by this 30% cap. And these are entities that don't tend to have a lot of income. And so there is a significant possibility that sponsors doing back leverage will not be able to deduct the interest.
Well,
didn't know about that one, huh?
No, but tomorrow, I assure you everyone will. Take all of this into account, Audrey. What kind of structure are you going to change your recommendation of the type of tax structure you recommend to your clients? Because the depreciation is going to be worth less it's going to be valued less. Do things like a master tenant, kind of inverted lease, do those things become more popular? I know it's a shameful word in the solar industry, but basis inflation, things of that nature. Are we going to see more, talk about those things?
I want to thank all of our SolarWakeup Live DC sponsors: GAF, Mintz Levin, NTCIC, Standard Solar, True Green Capital, and MMA Energy Capital. Sponsorship opportunities for SolarWakeup Live New York are now available. Contact me for more information. None of these events would be possible without the gracious support from these sponsors.
I don't know, is the short answer. We're going to talk about a lot of things, and I think the dust has to settle. I think it's also going to affect and this is half answering your question, half going back to your prior question. I think it's going to affect different subsectors differently. For instance, I think that potentially in solar, the distributed generation sector of solar is going to be less affected than the utility scale, because the capital needs of the distributed sector are less on sort of a per project, per portfolio basis than for the larger utility scale projects. So the larger utility scale projects are going to be looking to the kinds of investors that are going to be affected more by base erosion, for instance, than the distributed sponsors that are probably going to be tapping the family offices and maybe some corporates and strategics that may not have this exposure to base erosion. So I think there's going to be different impacts to the different subsectors, and we're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But yes, whether the questions like, are we going to take all of the depreciation in year one or on day one, those kinds of things are going to have to be looked at to optimize what there is, what candy is left in there, to see how we can cover as much of the stack as we've been doing it as we can. Yes.
So let's try to end on a positive note before we take a few questions. Does the lower tax rate bring more capital, like foreign pension funds that are very sensitive to the after-tax cash flow that they can bring back to their country? Does it bring more of those types of long-term, lower return hurdle capital to the solar market?
I think potentially yes, and that may be a good thing. It's like what the congressman said earlier. These things are disruptive and they're difficult, but there's capital out there, and capital finds its level, and there's still some, I think, some decent returns to be had in this environment for different kinds of capital, and whether it's tax equity or common equity or the debt. I think there's still opportunity out there, and look, you get technology and progress is inexorable, and I guess just to kind of end on at a higher level. Progress is going to continue. This is going to be a blip. It's going to cause everybody to stop and pause and look at what we're going to do. We've had headwinds before in this business. I think these are particularly difficult times, and people are concerned, and rightly concerned. But I think I do think we'll move through it.
Two quick questions to end it. Greg, what tax rate do you think descends at?
22 to 23, probably more likely 23.
And last question for you, Audrey. Does any tariff issued under 201 trigger change in law provisions for projects under construction?
It does if you have an EPC contract that doesn't have solar, where the modules aren't already procured, and there's change in law protection for the contractor. Yes, and also on power purchase agreements, there may be a flow-through effect there where the power pricing gets renegotiated. Again, it depends on what the individual contracts say, but yeah, if you've got projects under construction now and in development, you've got some change in law issues.
Time for one or two questions. I want to hear from Karen because she's a tax equity investor that many of you may know, but she also invests in other non-solar tax equities. So go ahead, Karen.
Just one comment, in the Senate bill, the House bill eliminates historic tax credits, the Senate bill protects it, but it's 20% taken over 5 years, so you have to qualify for it for each of the 5 years, which may push more investors towards solar, which is 1 year. You have to do tax planning for 1 year for solar to know what you're getting into. I was also going to ask about if you have some provision in your contracts that protects your return in the event of change in law, does that not trigger any of the safe harbor guaranteed returns triggers?
You talking about 2007-65?
Yeah, well, either one, because solar's not really either one of them, so we've just been cherry picking. But
Yeah. They don't, the return isn't the issue that it can't be guaranteed in 2007-65. It's the availability of the credits that can't be guaranteed. So the answer is no. And the change in law provision would only say that you change the model. What happens, it sort of depends on what stage of the transaction you're in. Let's say you've signed the deal, but there's either a change in law or a proposed change in law. The transaction still goes forward, but you redo the model so that the IRR is still the same. It's just how things get calculated to get you there, or what money has to be invested by the investor on second funding date, immediately after placement service.
well, these would be conditions that kick in after the system's in operation, not pre-closing.
Okay, so at that point, there's really nothing you can do other than change the cash, and the flip date is the flip date. So you'll hit the flip date, and you'll likely, change the cash distributions in such a way that you try and achieve the same target flip date that's in the deal.
Yeah, well, at that point, you can either extend the flip date or change the purchase price.
Well, no, not in the deals that we do.
It's going to be higher of a price or fair market value, so it's, you can.
Right, and fair market, but again, if you're in the deal and the pricing is certainly going to depend upon fair market value, and unless you talk to the Internal Revenue Service, fair market value would take the tax credits into account. But it wouldn't take the tax rate into account. So I guess we would have to talk about particulars to get an answer to that question.
Go ahead.
I was just curious, under the BEAT and how it would impact multinationals and such, right? As an investor, you're only able to offset 75% of your tax through tax credits, correct? So they can't do 100% of their tax liability.
Under the AMT, yes. The ACE provision in the AMT, that's correct.
Okay, so ostensibly, if we're talking about before and after having that 25% delta, this BEAT provision, I mean, conceptually then could fall within that 25% to be considered, so that the tax appetite of the investor would ostensibly stay roughly the same. Is that, or does it fall in a separate and distinct bucket that, as far as tax appetite?
The 75% rule is the corporate AMT. I don't believe it's the BEAT provision.
No,
I think what he's saying
the
is
before and after comparison.
Correct.
That the BEAT provision may not be any worse off than the AMT for a particular multinational, because the BEAT could fall within that 25% parameter to begin with. So
depends on how you stack the calculations, and we don't know the answer to that yet. They have not said which comes first, AMT or BEAT, and so yes, this is going to be entirely situational, depending upon the particular company.
Last question.
Right now, the major banks like U.S. Bank, Wells Fargo, PNC are the major providers of tax equity for these utility scale projects. Are they multinational corporations? So Wells Fargo, PNC, U.S. Bank are considered multinational. They have operations throughout the world.
Sure, lending operations offshore, absolutely.
So it doesn't have to do with your ownership. It has to do with where you make income.
Yeah.
So that would make a lot of the tax equity providers subject to this BEAT provision.
By the way, I would add Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank,
Probably
Citibank.
8 or 10 of them that are actually dominate the big piles of them.
Right.
Community banks are different.
Right, no, and the secondary part of that is what's, you know, a lot of the Wall Street banks that invest in tax equity are actually not just investing their own capital, they have corporate clients that are more multinationals that are going to be impacted by this as well. So there is a flow through of syndication. U.S. Bank, you know, a lot of it is their capital, some of it is not. You know, so the available pool of capital, I think at the end of the day, the result will have to be more outreach by the solar industry to talk to people like Audrey mentioned, the family offices, etc. And, you know, the detriment there is they're going to pay less in taxes because of low corporate tax
Did you
rates.
say earlier that you thought the corporate AMT would disappear?
That's my prediction, yes.
So how would the BEAT then impact on that if there's no corporate AMT?
The BEAT provision is entirely separate and overlapping. So, and the BEAT provision could disappear too, because it's not in the House bill, it's only in the Senate bill. So it's conceivable that both of those things go away and
And they raise the rate instead to offset the loss of revenue.
well, in the House bill, they would do more targeted anti-abuse rules. They got to do something, but the House bill has specific anti-abuse rules that are, as I said, targeted. The Senate deals with it with a blunt
So
instrument.
you said it was a revenue fix, so if they raise the tax
Corporate
rate,
AMT is a revenue
Right.
fix.
BEAT was not?
BEAT was not. BEAT is an
It's a
anti-abuse
cheating
rule.
fix.
It's a Swiss cheese, fingers in the dike fix.
We got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Greg and Audrey. Appreciate the time. We're going to go.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. And make sure that you review our podcast on iTunes. The more reviews we get, the more people are made aware of this podcast, which helps bring better interviews to you. Please make sure that everyone at your company and everyone you work with in the solar space is subscribed to the free daily Solar Wake Up newsletter, covering the most important topics in solar 5 days a week. As always, my name is Jan Brandt, the host of Energy Wake Up.